So why does some metal sound like this and some like this? How do we get from Elvis to Nurgle? The real question, what's the story of metal? Let's start simple with the 60s. The 60s rock renaissance bands began to create heavier and moodier songs. Rolling Stones with Painted Black, and the Beatles with Helter Skelter. These songs were influential, but we can trace metal back further than that. A lot of people agree that one progenitor of the sound to be James Cotton in the song Cotton Crop Blues. These sounds progressed and evolved into the 60s with bands like Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix, but they all coalesced into a single point, Birmingham, England. Tony Iommi was working his last shift at the factory, ready to tour with his band Mythology. Unfortunately, there was an accident that resulted in Iommi losing the tips of 2 of his fingers on his right hand.
This thing just come down on my hand, and your reaction to pull your hand back, I just pulled the ends off. I made some tips out of a squeezy bottle. And I sat there all night then, rubbing it down so it had shaped like a finger. And it was just something I developed over that period, and then it enabled me to be able to play.
Him and the drummer Bill Ward sought out members to start anew, adding Geezer Butler and Ozzy Osbourne to the band that would be known worldwide as Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath is iconic and coined as the grandfathers of metal, introducing music to the public that just simply hadn't been heard before. Both sound and societal commentary that just weren't eclectic to the contemporary flower power era music. By the 1980s, bands like Iron Maiden were firmly reaching into the British top 10, placing themselves within the cultural mainstream and as a dominant force in the music industry. As the decade rolled on, the music began to reach into America. Los Angeles found itself as the breeding ground for a new genre that would propel itself into the cultural limelight. Hair metal. Motley Crue, Alice Cooper, Poison, the list goes on. Being the first form of metal to get an album on #1 on Billboard 200, hair metal was so prolific in fact that in '85, artists from bands like Twisted Sister were giving testimony in Senate against the PMRC trying to censor the genre.
Songs allow a person to put their own imagination, experiences, and dreams into the lyrics. Ms. Gore was looking for sadomasochism and bondage, and she found it. Someone looking for surgical references would have found it as well.
Despite the PMRC's attempt to subvert the harmful rock and roll plague infecting the youth of America, it only emboldened the bands and made them more controversial, making them sell more records. Surprisingly though, in Los Angeles, there was something completely different brewing in the genre. Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax all emerged, faster and louder than anything heard before. Flash turned all notions of what metal could be up a notch. All of the big four of thrash were hugely successful, with Metallica earning some of the highest album sales of all time, next to artists like Michael Jackson and the Beatles. This precedent of heavier and heavier metal continued on as bands began exploring a part of the genre known as extreme metal, taking the shock factor up to 11. Death metal bands began forming in the mid-80s, with the first bands being San Francisco's Possessed in '83 and Florida's Death in '84, producing blast-beated, guttural vocaled underground hits. Death metal was never able to reach the cultural mainstream, but there were popular bands like Cannibal Corpse, who even got featured in an Ace Ventura movie. At the same time in the EU, Norwegian dudes in corpse paint were burning down churches, selling bits of their friend's skull who committed suicide, stabbing each other 23 times to death. Good old mayhem. They were producing another genre of extreme metal known as black metal, focused on more avant-garde, lo-fi instrumentation with paganistic and satanic subject matters. Here are some nice soothing examples of that. You could make hours of film on just the band Mayhem, and people already have. Check out the documentary Until the Light Dies or Lords of Chaos. Into the 90s, hair metal had already begun to fade, and thrash was losing its place to grunge metal with bands like Nirvana and Dead Kennedys. There are other bands like Pantera carving out new genres like groove metal. but grunge was at the top and thrash had begun to fade back into obscurity. This wasn't the end for metal, though. The late 90s produced a fusion of hip-hop, rap, hardcore, and heavy metal that many love and even more hate. Dave Mustaine from Megadeth even said that he'd rather have his eyelids ripped out than listen to the new genre. Eyelids Are Not New Metal exploded into cultural relevancy, with the apotheosis of the genre being in forms like Slipknot's Iowa, Korn's Follow the Leader, System of a Down's Toxicity, and Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory. From the 2000s onward, metal continued to enjoy popularity and success, with bands like Killswitch Engage and Bullet for My Valentine reaching high into the billboards. Nu metal's death also gave way to another genre, Gen, with its syncopated and polyrhythmic guitar instrumentation being attributed to Meshuggah's guitarist. It also gave birth to a genre almost as equally hated as nu metal. Deathcore was an amalgamation of blast beats, growls, and slammy breakdowns, which for some reason a lot of people didn't like. The genre was heralded by bands like Thy Art Is Murder and Suicide Silence. Despite the Nickelback treatment from the metal community, both bands were able to reach into the Billboard 200s. From the 2010 onwards, there haven't been huge shifts in the metal scene. There are interesting stories to come out of it, like Lamb of God's Randy Blythe, who accidentally killed a 19-year-old by throwing him off stage in 2010, or in 2014 with As I Lay Dying's frontman being arrested in 2014 for attempting to hire an undercover hitman to kill his wife. Even though there haven't been huge shifts in metal, the scene has continued to produce subgenres and sounds so vastly different from each other, it's hard to call it all metal. From Camelot to Archspire, what really is metal? Well, like all music, it's an expression. From religion to war, from heartbreak and depression, all the thematic elements and different instrumentation being so different, a good comparison would be the spectrum of color. If you haven't listened to metal before, I'm sure there's some combination of avant-garde, black doom synth pop, or Japanese metal reggae ska punk band that will interest you. And yes, that exists, and they're called Sim, and they're pretty good.